What is up, everyone? All right, today, boom, Malice by John Gwynne, and I'm sorry. I'm just sorry in advance because I know a lot of people like this book, and I don't have great things to say about it, so yeah, sorry. I can link some reviews of people who did like this book. I know Abby liked this book, Alan, let me think. Alex Nieves liked this book a lot and this series. Basically, anyone whose name begins with an A, they like this book. So I'll link some of their reviews in the description. Also, I will not be reading Valor because of how much I didn't like Malice. But I hear Valor is better than Malice, according to most people. So if you like Malice, keep going, obviously. But yeah, this is going to be spoiler-free talks about some of the reasons I did not like this book. Okay, so first I have to talk about the plot. The plot, oh my gosh, the plot. It was very slow. The first half of the book drags on a lot. We're getting introduced to a lot of different characters and a lot of different perspectives, and not all that much is happening. We're kind of learning about the world, right? But we're not really learning about the world in a way that's interesting, or at least to me. And there's cool things in the world, like there's giants, there's like giant worms, and the giants can like cast fireballs and stuff, and then the giants ride on these creatures, and I forget what they're called, but yeah, those are cool. So the things we learn about are like very cool factor things, but not very deep, I guess. And we learn a lot about like fighting styles in different regions. And that stuff just doesn't interest me too much, which is kind of weird because I'm a fantasy reader. So you would think like fights would interest me, but battles are not really why I read fantasy. But I think if you like battle scenes a lot, you would probably like this book. Even though there aren't a whole lot of battles early on, the pace and the battles definitely pick up later on in the book. And just the explanation of fighting styles and tactics and all of that, very cool. But to me, like the rest of the world building wasn't all that exciting. It felt fairly stereotypically fantasy to me. And by that, I mean the world felt like just regular fantasy. And like a lot of the things within the plot just feels like things that you would find in another fantasy book or like 10 other fantasy books maybe. Which can be okay. If you like those fantasy tropes and the fairly standard fantasy world, you might like this. But I don't know. I feel like you can have tropes but distinguish different places better than the different cities were distinguished in this book. Even if you look at the map in this book. So like, let's say we're in this area over here. It's like an area, and then there's a river, and then there's a forest. And when they're describing the area, they're like, yeah, it's a city, and then there's a river, and then there's a forest. And then over here, it's like, oh, there's a river, there's a city, and it's next to the forest. And there's some mountains over here. And then over here, there are some mountains up here. And it's like, oh, I don't know. It just felt like the same old. And the way different places were distinguished a lot of times was like, we use this fighting style. They used that fighting style. And there were a few other like things and stuff, but there weren't interesting cultural differences between a lot of the cities, or that's how it felt like to me. So I guess what I'm saying is not only was it tropey, it was like this place is tropey and that place is also tropey and that third place is also tropey, but maybe in a slightly different way. And when people from all these different places come together, it's just a bunch of tropes. It's just a bunch of characters who are not interesting talking about the places they're from, and it's just so uninteresting. So, and that brings us to the characters. None of the characters really stood out to me. The main character is Corbin, and he's like 14 coming into adulthood. And yeah, I don't know. He just felt very tropey. It felt like I've read this story many times before, and I don't know if like the characters are boring to me because the plot is boring to me. Like Corbin's plot, it's like very obvious what is going to happen. It's like very telegraphed, at least certainly in the first half of the book. And it reminds me of other books that do this trope, but they do the trope way faster. Like there's no reason we had to spend like 5 chapters in the first half of this book setting up Corbin's relationships to other characters, we'll say, to be vague. Then there's this character named Evnis. And Evnis, I don't know. He's just always thinking about like this prophecy and like there's going to be a God War. You hear the line, what do you think about the future God War? Or, I know there's a God War coming. Like, that line, there's like one version or another of it 3 million times in this book. Evnus, I don't even know who he is. If a God War wasn't happening within like the next few months in this story, I could barely tell you a thing about Evnus. In all seriousness, it felt like he was just waiting around. His perspective was by far the least interesting. Then we had Veritas, and he was with Nathir, and Veritas is this swordsman person, and Nathir is like this prince or whatever. So we start following Veritas around when he becomes on the prince's loyal squad of swordsmen and stuff. And Veritas has like an inferiority complex with his brother, and like, I don't know. So that's like kind of like a common thing you see in fantasy books. But this book, instead of having just one character with like an inferiority complex to a family member, there's like 10 characters who all are like, oh my gosh, my dad likes my brother way more than me. Or like, how can I ever live up to my father's expectations or my uncle's? It's like, oh, it feels like all of the characters in this book have that, some version or another of that sort of, I don't know, imposter syndrome or competitiveness with family members. And then Nathir, I don't know. I feel like I figured out exactly where his story was going very quickly. And then I was just kind of watching it play out. And I liked the concept for Nathir's story arc. I feel like it could have been done better. And I feel as though it was too obvious where his story was going, to me at least. And then we had Corbin's sister, who was kind of cool, and some other characters. Probably too many other characters, if I'm being honest. All right, so let's talk about the writing style, which I've hinted at a few times, just with kind of the telegraphed nature of some of the plots, you know, the heavy-handedness of the foreshadowing, we could say. But the dialogue, that, oh my gosh. Everything was said in, like, the most direct possible way, because I was talking about a bunch of the character stories talking about the future inevitable God War that was just around the corner. And an example of like dialogue between characters would be like, I had a dream last night. I was told that the God War is coming. What do you think about the God War coming? Oh, I'm happy to have you on the side in the future God War. It felt like someone transcribed my D&D campaign and just all of the dialogue, all of the very cliche dialogue and the like overly direct dialogue. And then they're like, oh, that's great dialogue. We'll just keep that dialogue, throw it in there. It's very direct. It's very easy to understand. But like, maybe, but it was super boring. Oh my gosh. Can't like any of the characters say something interesting in like not the most boring and cliche way? And this book, like, it hit all of like the just boring dialogue D&D tropes. I talked to one person for 15 minutes before I ran my first game of D&D as the DM. And they were like, yeah, just try to like have characters that are a bit interesting and maybe a bit outside the norm. And I'm like, okay, I just like won't have a neutral good blacksmith. I will try to think of like a more interesting blacksmith and maybe like a more interesting king, more interesting lord. But this book, like, it's like, oh, there's a blacksmith. We're going to make him so neutral good. He's going to be like the most clearly neutral good person ever. He's going to stay out of everything most of the time. But like when push comes to shove, he's neutral good. So he's got to do the right thing because he is a blacksmith. Actually, I feel like if you transcribed a cliche version of my blacksmith, it might be more interesting than this blacksmith, because I would say like in the middle of sentences and stuff. So you could read that blacksmith as like a Cali girl, and it's like, do you want like a one-handed sword or a two-handed sword? And I mean, I'm not saying it would be good, but you know, it would be like not the most cliche blacksmith you ever did see. That was a horrible impression of a Cali girl, by the way. I thought I might have that impression in my range, but nope, I do not. All right, but yeah, I don't even know what else to say. It's just, this made me sad. I'm probably never going to think about this book again or this series, except when all you booktubers out there inevitably talk about it a million times. I'm definitely not really a huge fan of John Gwynne's writing style. I don't know if I'd pick up another one of his books. I kind of like the world building in terms of like battles and fights and stuff, but I don't know. I feel like he could have done like political intrigue better. Like, you guys know I love my political intrigue. And sometimes I'm okay with like, a very basic political intrigue thing where I know what's coming and blah, 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 or whatever. But that always happens in like a way shorter book, and I'm way more likely to forgive it if it doesn't spend 30 pages doing political intrigue setup. If it's just like, oh, like this person's evil because they're evil. I'm like, okay, well, you could have explained that better or made the villain more complex, but I understand that you just put this villain in to a book and didn't really do much setup with the villain, so I'm more likely to forgive it. And to be clear, the villains in this book aren't bad, quote unquote. And in fact, there could be a lot of different villains depending on how different characters' character arcs go. But yeah, the villains in here weren't like bad, but they weren't good enough for the amount of development time that it took to set them up. And I'm sure like blah, 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 they get better in the next books in the series. Yeah, maybe they do, but I don't care. And I'm not continuing on with the series. Oh, and I did like Camlin, actually. He was all right. His dialogue was still bad, but as a character, sure. Camlin. Oh, I actually had a hilarious ship at the end of this book. So I'm going to have to ask someone if that ship that I have at the end of the book actually happens. But yeah, that's everything. I'm sorry, everyone. You like, comment, and subscribe. There's definitely some other people out there who don't like Malice. Leanna, Books with Brittany, Klaus. So I guess I'm not alone in disliking Malice. But again, I'll say the majority of people like Malice. So yeah, anyway, see you guys later. And tell me why I'm wrong in the comments section. All right, bye.